Hey, welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Last week, we did an interview in episode 129 with Peira Moinester, the co-owner, co-founder of Brooklyn Music Factory. And we were answering a question that we often get. How do I find people to recruit to my school, whether it's for a seasonal program, as Peira was talking about, or just your year-round lessons, group lessons, after-school programs, preschool programs? How do you find people to recruit? How do you find people to hire? And one of the things I really loved about that episode was the fact that we didn't just stay in the abstract. We really got into some of the nitty-gritty details, down to Peira even talking about how she labels contacts in her phone so she can go back and network with people and perhaps find good candidates for BMF. In that episode, I saw an opportunity for a second episode, and that is to actually get into the steps of the hiring process, perhaps even going into the details of how Peira conducts an interview. So we thought we'd do another episode 130 here, to dig deeper into the logistics, the strategy, the how-to of interviewing teachers for the school and what that process looks like. So welcome back, Peira.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Cool. Nate?
I was just going to say I've sat in. Peira, what would you estimate? How many interviews have we done together in our career?
I can't. I don't even. It's like
hundreds.
Oh yeah, we might be getting up to the 1,000 mark.
Yeah, and so, and all I'll say is that for our listeners, Peira, you're just an absolute master at reading people well and efficiently. And over the years, as we've done, so I think there's tons to learn just in some of your techniques and how to develop that intuition. But also, we've really refined our system. You know, I mean, it takes years to come up with something where you can do an interview in 22 minutes and be like, yes, no, maybe, good, move the Asana card, bam, next step. You know, so anyways, I'm looking forward to you sharing all the wisdom that's been acquired over the years.
Well, first of all, thank you, Nate. I will say, just in response to the intuition part, when I first was learning how to coach teachers, I swear this is related. It was very challenging because I had taught on intuition for so long. But actually, I learned that the intuition is actually skills that I can articulate. And it's the same thing when it comes to interviews. What seems like intuition are actually a set of skills that I can help articulate for your listeners that they can put to good use. And so it's not something that is as magical as it seems.
Yeah, no, we want to demystify the process.
Yeah.
And I think again, you're really good at this, which is like just encouraging others to try. Like, go ahead, follow these steps and keep at it, you know? So, okay.
But even then, everyone who's listening or watching on YouTube should have a little grace for themselves, because whenever you do something 1,000 times, if you observe someone who does something 1,000 times, it will seem like magic to you. So go, please try, and then keep trying and keep trying and keep trying, because then that's where you develop that sense of intuition, as Nate said. Here, I think a great way to start the episode would be to give people the overall context of what we're going to be talking about, perhaps a list of steps of what that hiring and interviewing process looks like, so that people can kind of keep track mentally in their head as they listen through, and then we'll go back through and fill in the details on the outline. So what are those steps that you think of when you're moving from getting a pool of applicants and recruits into actually deciding who gets to work with BMF?
All right. Step one, when it comes to is a part of the recruitment process. We talked about this a lot in the last episode. Step one is building your job description. Step two, we also discussed in the last episode, which is to build your calendar. How many months are you going to need for this process? What are the stops along the way? Step three is then post your job description up on Indeed, in addition to recruiting through your internal network. So like we talked about in our last episode, reaching out to the people in your phone contacts, reaching out to your teachers. So you've got your Indeed ad going, and then you've got your internal network outreach. Step 4 is then to start screening those resumes that are coming in on Indeed. Step 5 would be to ask any follow-up questions for any resumes that are coming on Indeed that are those question marks for you. And then step 6 is to invite those who you feel like are qualified to a Zoom interview. I personally like a Zoom interview, and we can talk more about why. Step 7 is then an in-person demo. Our candidates who are qualified for the next step actually come in person to demonstrate their skills in the classroom. Step 8 is then to get references. I need to reach out to their references if I feel like they are a top candidate for me. The next step is to do follow-up questions. If I have any remaining questions, don't leave those hanging. We'll talk more about that. And then if I feel like I've got my list of candidates who I'm ready to press go on, we send them an offer sheet. Once they've accepted their offer, we do background check, and then they get their contracts. And so that is the recruiting to hiring process from A to Z. I lost track of my numbers, but you get the idea.
We were just up to double digits.
I love it. That's cool.
Peira, I in prep for this portion of the episode, I actually pulled up an Evernote from way back in the day. I think it was just coming out of, maybe it was like 2, 3, 4 years ago, and we were rebuilding team in a large way at the factory. So we were doing lots of we were back in a rebuild maybe it was post-COVID or just coming out of it. And I just want to read you a couple of the notes you get. Remember, we were sitting in the park and you gave me like that awesome rundown. And, we're going to get into the details here, but I want to highlight one of the last things that you said, which is you need to be very cognizant of that step 9, or was it 8, where you face the red flags. You need to get the references, and you need to take that one last extra step of reaching out, calling them if you have a question, and addressing that. And I just wanted to highlight that because we might run out of time in this app, and we might not even get to how to address the red flags beyond the interview stage. But I'm highlighting that because I think that's one of those systems strengths that you are quite good and disciplined with, which is you get to that last phase and we so badly want to be like, you're all in, come to a pizza party. But actually, you got to just ask that one last question.
Yes.
Right? If there's a question on your mind, it means it's valid. So I started with the end in mind here because I was just reminded of a great chat we had in the park years ago on this very subject.
This episode is sponsored by grouplessons.com. If you're looking for a group piano method that is easy to implement in your studio or school, look no farther than Piano Express from grouplessons.com. Because unlike most group piano methods, Piano Express allows students to make individual progress within the context of a larger group. And because of the at-home practice tools and gamified curriculum, students using the Piano Express method make faster progress than the average method book student. And that helps students feel excited, accomplished, and motivated to learn new music. Also, the system is really adaptable. We've got teachers using the system in their home studios, and we have many large commercial studios running our 3-room model that allows you to see up to 24 students per hour with just 2 teachers. So if you'd like to learn more about Piano Express, navigate to grouplessons.com and sign up for a free demo. You'll get to look at the method, our app and teacher guides, and we'll even give you a sneak peek of our implementation plan that has helped hundreds of studios start their group program in just a few weeks.
We've talked about networking in detail.
Right.
We talked about recruitment. We talked about job description. So I think we're on to resume review.
Resumes.
Okay,
Yeah.
love it. Maybe that's number 3.
Well, so this is going to be interesting because I think we ended our last episode with me talking about something pretty warm and fuzzy, which is that hiring is all about building relationships. And even when you're rejecting people, you want to be thinking about those long-term relationships. And that you want to maintain those positive relationships because those relationships will come back around and can help in the future. And also, just like we said, making sure to treat people like human beings and not like, candidates. So this is going to sound like the opposite of that warm and fuzzy, but you got to be a little ruthless when it comes to resumes. So you got to pull that part out of you. And so I would say when it comes to looking at resumes, you want to think when it comes to resumes versus interviews, you want to think along these lines. Resumes are about skills. Interviews are about values. Okay. So when I'm looking at resumes, I'm not reading values. I'm just looking for a straight up set of skills. And that's where I get ruthless. I need somebody, we talked about in the last episode, that I was looking for people this summer who could work with fours and fives. I see somebody whose resume seems wonderful, but they've only worked with sixth grade and up. I got to cut them. And so that's where the ruthlessness comes in, because you say to yourself, oh, this person has so much experience. Look, they've been teaching music for 10 years. They do not have experience with 4 and 5-year-olds. That resume has got to go. And so, like I said, it's not the warm and fuzzy part, but it's really important. And as you learn to, as you go through more and more resumes, you will get better at that part of things. Now, one way that's really helpful in this process is to remember your non-negotiables. So we talked about the non-negotiables in the last episode. When it comes to the job description, stick to those non-negotiables. Trust yourself. You already did the work. You did the work. You created the job description. You sat down. You said, what does this job need? Okay. You maybe did it last year and revised it a little bit this year. Trust yourself. You already did the work. You know what your non-negotiables are. Does this resume have those non-negotiables? No, then it has to go. Does this resume have those non-negotiables? Wonderful. If you have a couple of follow-up questions, maybe message those follow-up questions. There's been a couple of times when I've seen a resume that was maybe had my non-negotiables. Like Nate said, when we were talking about the end process, it also starts at the beginning of the process where you want to just ask those questions about those red flags. I've said to people, do you have experience with 4 and 5-year-olds? If so, how many years? I can't quite tell from this resume. So that's where the resume reading skills start to get stronger. But by trusting yourself, by knowing you've done the work, by creating a really strong job description and knowing your non-negotiables and look for those. I would say about 25% of candidates get through to the next stage, which is then the Zoom interview. I really love Zoom interviews. I used to do them in person, and I will tell you why. Once again, this is not the warm and fuzzy part of things. I find that Zoom interviews are really helpful because if it's not going well, somebody hasn't gotten on the subway and come all the way to BMF and, taken time out of their day to come there. And I feel like I have to give them their full 30 minutes. If it's a Zoom interview and it's not going well, I can cut it at 15. I try to give them 15.
That's wild. I love that. Keep going. This is awesome.
It's really helpful. And you don't have to waste anyone's time. I will say I try to give everyone a full 15, but the better I've got at interviews, the more I know within the first 5 usually, but I give them the full 15 at least.
Well, okay, hold on. Just pause right there.
Yeah.
So I was just trying to remember your techniques for sort of shaking someone loose that you know is not a good candidate. And by the way, the reframe we always say is let's not waste their time. Honor their time. If there's no chance they're going to get the gig. So what's an immediate within 5 minutes red flag for you? And then can you just give us like 1 or 2 techniques for ending the Zoom early?
Absolutely. So the first thing is I will say I start every interview the same, which is tell me your story. Give me the 2-minute. I make sure that I give them a time frame. Give me the 2-minute version of your journey to this seat here with me today. And then they will share with me their version of their journey to this seat with me today, which gives me so much of what I need to know. It tells me so much about where I need to go with the interview. And pretty quickly, I will know if there is the possibility for them to be the right fit. Obviously, you can't know somebody in a 2-minute summary, right? But you can know a lot about what they choose to share. You can know a lot by what they choose to share. Because once again, like I said, resumes are for skills, interviews are for values, right? So what do they choose to share? What are their stops along the way? What are the things that they are sharing has been meaningful to them? Because they are choosing their story, right? I'm not saying, tell me about when you first picked up your instrument. Some people might share when they first picked up their instrument, and some people might go right to their internship they had in college. You know, for me personally, the person who starts their story by sharing about the meaning of first picking up their instrument tells me a lot about them and their values and what that meant to them. If somebody shares with me about a meaningful teacher along the way, somebody who really impacted them, or a child that they really had a meaningful relationship with, they're speaking to Brooklyn Music Factory values. If somebody tells me maybe the score they've gotten on exams as part of their share, it's telling me something about them and what's important to them, right? And so I learn a lot in those 2 minutes of just tell me about your journey. I usually give them a little context. I say, your teaching / musical journey that brought you to this seat here with me today. Okay, so there's that, Nate. That's the starter. When it comes to, you asked me for specific tools about closing the interview. I have learned how to interrupt gracefully.
Show us.
I will say words like, I'm going to stop you right there. Sentences like that.
I'm going to stop you right there.
Yeah, exactly.
I love this. Okay, I'm kidding. Jokes aside, keep going.
Hey, wait a minute. So yeah, I'm going to say things like, I'm going to stop you right there. Thank you so much. You thank them so much for sharing their story and for their time. Once again, you're still ending these relationships in a way that honors who they are as a person. But it is okay to interrupt people and stop them if you feel like you know that it's not going to be the right fit. And then the other thing is, to close things out, I often give people a very realistic time frame of when they're going to hear from me. And that is a great way to end the interview. I will just say, just so you know, I'm doing these for a few weeks. You're not going to hear from me for a few weeks. So that I'm not all of a sudden in 3 days getting the email like, hey, how did it go? You know, because I'm giving myself time, because I know it's going to take me a few weeks. I'm honoring them by saying, you're not going to hear from me for a while. And then it's also just a great way to close an interview.
And it also goes back to your initial point that you went into detail on the last step on just having a calendar. You're like, all of these people will hear from me by March 1st or whatever it is, you know?
Yes. And then if they aren't going to, I make sure to send those emails and let them know I need a little more time. So communication is really important.
So maybe we jump in. So I've passed the first 5 minutes. I've made it to minute 6 in an interview. Take us into the next stage of your interview process, if you would.
So I have an outline of questions. It's a reference for me, but it's not the Bible, right? And so I use it as a way to remember the different bullet points that I want to make sure I hit up. But the truth is, those first few minutes tell me their strengths and their weaknesses most often. And so what I will do is I will pick and choose from my set questions, the questions that I feel like tap into the places that I suspect are their weaknesses. So if somebody has told me, for example, I need to be hiring somebody for group classes, having group experience is a non-negotiable for me. I looked at their resume and it looked as if they had group experience. But then once they tell me their story, I can see their group experience is minimal. And that they've taught private lessons much more than they've taught groups, right? This is just an example. So I am going to go directly to my question about classroom management. Tell me a little bit about classroom management. What are some tools that you use in classroom management? And so the reason I love them telling that story at the beginning is because it gives me my little check boxes of the points that I need to go for, where I'm like, I suspect this is a weakness. If somebody has told me I've worked in kindergarten classrooms for 10 years, doing music for 10 years, I'm not going to ask them about classroom management. I'm not going to waste anybody's time. You know what I mean? Maybe I'll ask a little question just to get a couple of their tools. But no, I'm going to maybe go to, how do you organize your time? You know what I mean? Or tell me about your relationships with parents.
Could you, for the benefit of our listeners, just list your questions?
Oh, sure.
Oh, I'll write them down. I promise you.
You want me to pull them up?
Yeah, literally. I want you to that would be amazing. That kind of,
Like I said, I start with a story. And once again, these are my questions that not all of them get asked, and that's intentional. My next question would be, what attracted you to teaching? Why did you want to be a music teacher? What gets you excited and inspired? See, that is really a values question, right? So if I didn't really get that in their story, if they started with sort of their resume bullet points, and they haven't really told me about the why, I want to know that pretty soon. Because like I said, interviews are really for values. Describe what your classroom feels like. What is the atmosphere when you walk into one of your classes? How would your students describe you? That's another question when I want to learn a little bit about their values when it comes to tone in the classroom and their relationships with students. This one's a little bit of a cliche interview question. I don't ask it that often, but I still think it's important for me to have on my list, which is, what do you consider your greatest asset as a teacher? I'll ask that at the end if I feel like I still need a little more clarity on who they are. What are their strengths? I haven't been able to put my finger on it. Maybe they can help clarify that for me a little bit. I will ask them about a time that's kicked their butt. Tell me about a time that really kicked your butt in teaching, and what did you learn from that? How has your teaching changed since that experience? I think it's really revealing when somebody can tell a story of a time that they haven't succeeded, and what they have learned from that, and how they've made adjustments, if they've made adjustments at all. I think all of those points are revealing. Sometimes, if I'm not really sure, if I suspect that they're more of a musician and less of a teacher, I will ask them a little bit about relationships with kids in their life. Tell me about a kid in your life who has, tell me about a student in your life who's really impacted you. And tell me about a student in your life that you feel like you've really made an impact on. And I want to hear them say that child's name. I want to say, oh, I remember little Sammy. Sammy came in, was so shy. I want to hear that story. I want to hear that they are really building relationships with kids. And then if I want to even dig a little bit deeper when it comes to their relationships, I will ask them to tell me about a teacher that impacted them. Somebody who they have taken through their teaching, and sort of always have in their mind as somebody who they set as the standard, on how they and why that person is the standard for them, and how that person their influence, how that person is reflected in their teaching. I will ask nuts and bolts things like, what's your approach to classroom management? What approach do you find works best, particularly with, and then I might give some examples if I really suspect that they struggle with classroom management. Tell me about a kid who, what would you do with a child who always is interrupting? I'll give some examples if I really want. I'm like, I feel like this person might struggle in the classroom. When it comes to, if I haven't, like Nate and I said, I think we said this in the last episode, we're always thinking long term. And so I will often ask, what are your goals for the next 3 years? Where would you like to be in 3 years? And what do you see for yourself? If I am interviewing somebody that I say, this person's technically a seasonal hire, but I can really see this person fitting really well into Brooklyn Music Factory, I'll make sure to ask those questions. And find out, like, do they want to be on Broadway in 3 years? Or would they like to be teaching music for the rest of their life? And that's really revealing to me when I'm having that conversation in my mind. Is this person more than a seasonal hire? I oftentimes close out with a couple of questions that are super revealing. I will ask them their top 3 values, their top 3 values that they live by. And people sometimes struggle with that. But what they share is really revealing about who they are. And then this question, which seems like a sort of a cliche interview question that I find incredibly important, is then closing with, tell me what you know about what we do and how we do it. It is shocking to me how often people don't know what we do and how we do it. And it always gives me pause. Well, if you don't know what we do and how we do it, why do you want this job? And so if it is clear to me that the person is like, just saw an Indeed ad and didn't actually do the research, that is telling to me. If somebody said, oh, I looked at your YouTube page and your YouTube channel, and I watched a bunch of the videos and I love songwriting and I saw that your kids songwrite, that is so revealing to me in terms of whether they are a good fit for Brooklyn Music Factory or not.
This episode is sponsored by BigMusicGames.com. As our listeners know, Brooklyn Music Factory is all about a fun, fluency-first approach to music lessons. And at the foundation of our teaching methods are rhythm, melody, harmony, and songwriting games that challenge students as young as 4 years old to train their ears and flex that musical mind. Because when you set an intention of gamifying every single lesson, you're going to find improved attendance, increased play at home, and higher student retention. So we've set up a website just for our listeners so you can start playing today. Go to bigmusicgames.com/7FMS and create your free account. Again, that's bigmusicgames.com/7FMS. And if you join today, I'm going to send you a personal invite to join our weekly teacher training call with me and Greggy Bizzle, our chief game designer. Go ahead and put play back into practice with Big Music Games.
You know what's mind-bending to me, Peira, is that the people that are applying grew up in the age of rapid research. Like, they have access to all the information in a way that you and I would not intuitively go right there.
Yeah, well, that last question will take somebody from an A candidate to a B candidate, or B candidate to an A candidate.
Like that.
And I never miss that question, no matter what. Unless it's somebody who I'm like, I want to end this call, I can tell that they're not a good fit.
Yeah, that would have happened, but 5 minutes in, you would have.
Yeah, exactly. But I never miss that question. It is super revealing, and I find that question to be really valuable.
It's totally reminds me. I know, again, this may feel off topic, but it feels connected to me in the work we do, which is, I remember when I was a young jazzer in the city, and someone said to me, if you really want to play with that drummer, go learn all of his music. And then call him up and be like, hey, can we play your music? Yeah. And I was like, it blew my mind. And then I heard that there's a great jazz pianist named Benny Green who literally did that to get a gig. He went and learned every tune and then showed up at a jam session. It's like, I know all your music. What do you want to play? Yeah. That's an extreme example, but at least you could watch the BMF YouTube channel.
On the Instagram. Totally.
Yeah, at least you could go to IG and just be like, man, I really love this post by Clover singing her original song.
Yeah. And if somebody can cite something that they've seen online about us and how it relates to them and their own values, that is so telling, and that really, that question at the end, I keep it for the end for a reason, because when they don't know, I do give a short share, and then ask them to share their reaction to my share. But I don't want to do that share at the beginning of the interview when I'm about to ask all the other questions.
Yeah,
and
right.
So that is why, that's why it's always my closer, because I do give a short share, and then I give them the opportunity to ask any questions. And so not necessarily about the curriculum, but I just say, do you have any questions for me? And the people who are my top candidates very often have come prepared with a couple of questions.
They always do.
Yes.
And they're not, how much does this pay?
No.
No, they're not that question. That's like a classic red flag question.
Right, exactly.
Can I just frame a couple things you've said just for our listeners? Because so there's two things you said, and honestly, you gave a list of a lot of questions. Like,
I know.
All our listeners should 100% be writing these down and then rewriting them in the way that sounds authentic to them. This is not it is not a cut and paste job, to be, authentic as an interviewer. And like we were talking about, when we've done like coming up on 1,000 interviews, like you've found questions that work for you. But just to frame what you said and highlight what you said, it's like you're not using all of them. You're using like 3 to 5 of them tops. And you're basing that first, if I heard you correctly, you're basing that first 5 to 7 minutes. Those first 5 to 7 minutes are actually what define the next 20 minutes.
Absolutely. I would say the first 3 minutes define the next 20 minutes.
So there's something fascinating here, because it's like you need to get those first 3 minutes right. Like if you're going to practice, like let's say you're going to interview the next 20 people over the next 6 months, really make sure you're recording your interviews, obviously. And then, sorry, maybe that's not obvious, but that's another boon to Zoom, right? Yeah. But then go back and study your opening 3 minutes. What do you look and sound like? What are you actually asking? What's actually happening in those first 3 to 5 minutes?
Nate, I'm glad you brought up the recording, because I should have mentioned that, before I even open up to them, I do 2 things. Number 1 is tell them who I am, so they know who they're talking to. Introduce myself and my role. And number 2 is I ask their permission to record the interview. And so that is my opener to my opener.
Well, and just for our listeners, you're not always interviewing alone. Sometimes you're interviewing their team interviews. Yeah. And sometimes, like Jessica will play the introduction role. She'll say, "Let me introduce you to the team," and then she'll say, "We'd like to record." But there's always a tag at the end. We'd like to record this if that's okay, because we want to share it with the rest of the hiring team.
Exactly.
And so it's pretty hard to be like, no, don't record this if you...
I've never had somebody say don't record it. Like you said, they're growing up in the era of...
everything's recorded.
It's so true. Yeah.
But I just like to be transparent about the process. I find that it builds trust.
Yeah, totally. And actually, I want to say one other thing about you in interviews, because I've watched you interview a bazillion times. Okay, maybe more like 1,000. And then I want to ping it back to Daniel to see where he'd like to take it next in this. But there is something that's super important. And again, I think you do this really well, which is you create, in order for someone to feel like they can give an open and honest answer, you actually, as the interviewer, have to sort of be open and a little bit vulnerable yourself. Like,
absolutely.
When you say you introduce yourself, you always do it in a way where you're like, there's always a little humor, because that's how you operate all the time. And then it's like, and you're like, and we're just so excited you could be here and everything. But I wonder if you could even give us your open. Like, how do you introduce yourself in an interview to help our listeners maybe start to frame how they'd introduce themselves and try to build trust right out of the gate?
Well, it's funny that you're saying that, because you made me realize something that I always do. which is even before that opener, which is I make sure that I'm smiling a little bit when the Zoom opens. People are really nervous when they come to interviews.
Oh, 100%.
And I find that if I'm smiling a little bit, it sets the tone and it relaxes them a little bit, and I can see more who they really are. So it's for everybody's benefit. Not everybody is a big, smiler, but just for me, making sure that I am smiling before that Zoom even opens is an intentional effort. And I make sure that I'm doing that. And then, Jessica does the introduction so beautifully, Nate. I wish she was here to describe how she does her introductions. But basically, I will just share, my name. I'm co-founder at Brooklyn Music Factory. And then I will share a little bit about my role. My primary role at Brooklyn Music Factory is director of camps. We run camps full year round. But in addition, I do a lot of the hiring and interviews, and that's why you're sitting here with me today, because I often do hiring and interviews for things beyond camp. And so just to give them a tiny little bit of context of who they're talking to and why I'm the person sitting there with them. Nice. But I find that the opening with a joyful energy is really just as important.
Yeah.
So
I think this goes back to something that was said, or that I said in the previous episode when I made that reference to the Brian King episode, is that if you are in the habit of being social, of being friendly, coming into an interview and your social self coming out right at the beginning to signal to the other person that they're safe, that this isn't going to be awkward, you don't actually have to say a lot, and you don't have to put on a Broadway show or put on a song and dance to entertain them and make them feel like just even simple questions can be helpful, can be effective, but it's oftentimes the way they're said and the energy you're giving off, much less the actual things that you're saying. People will remember how you made them feel, not the things you said.
Yeah. And if we go back to the last episode, you might remember I said, being joyful is a non-negotiable. And so that's part of the job here at Brooklyn Music Factory. You know what I mean? I'm not interviewing a police officer. I don't know if joyful is part of being a police
the job,
officer, but you're right. I'm just I'm sure those interviews feel and look different, At Brooklyn Music Factory, being joyful is part of the gig. It's a non-negotiable. And so if I set that tone, I'm going a little off track here, but at camp, when I'm on site, I consider tone setting to be one of my number one jobs, And so why wouldn't I take that into the interview that I want somebody for somebody who I want to work at that summer camp? You know what I mean? I want that interview to feel the same way that I want the job to feel. And if somebody isn't vibing in that way, that tells me something, So, it's interesting, Nate. I had never actually put it into words until you started talking about that.
Well, Peira, it's like so many. Actually, Daniel made this point, and it was a really good one. Last episode that we did together, where he just repeated. He's like, "Look, actually, it might have even been earlier in this ep. He's like, look, if you've done something 1,000 times, it's going to actually appear magical and effortless."
Right.
And so we're just saying, hold on, can we just slow ourselves down enough to be like, this is what we actually say and do?
Yes.
Which is, it's hard to do when you're deep in anything, Yeah.
And let's be honest, sometimes you'll be cut right out of some difficult meeting, or you'll have just, run from the subway. I keep referencing the subway. I know not everybody who's listening to this runs from the subway, but you're going to have to turn that on for the interview. And I find that the best way to turn it on is to just go like this.
Yeah, totally. So can I ask you a couple questions then on this? Because it's a perfect segue running from the subway to the demo. To the interview.
Yeah.
And you referenced it earlier. You said I can stack interviews. I'm curious if you could give us a number. What's your limit? How many of the interviews in a row can you do in any given day? And then how many could you do in a week without actually just realizing you're you're not even able to do the interview effectively?
I can very concretely answer this question. 3 in a row is ideal, 4 in a row is max, and then I can do another bunch in the afternoon, but actually like stacked interview to interview, by the 4th one, I'm starting to lose track of what I've said and what I haven't said to each person. So
Right.
4 is my absolute, like I'll do like 10 a.m. to noon, 4 30-minute interviews. I will take a nice break, and then I might start up again at 1 or 2 and then do like 2 to 4, but 4 in a row, that's my absolute max. In terms of just my own brain power and being able to track what I'm saying and who I'm talking to. Because
Right.
you start to feel, Yeah.
Well, you start to, and I actually want to highlight something here, because again, I feel like we're pounding this, but we get the question all the time, like, how do you find a good teacher? Like you just said, there's the potential that you'll interview 8 people in one day over the course of 2-4 interview chunks. That's like true commitment to one thing in a day.
Yeah.
And so if you're listening to this and you're like, I can't find a piano teacher and I interviewed like 2 people over the last month. Well, okay, hold on. We need to really focus on recruitment, and then we need to start stacking, and we need to figure out how to get a lot more resumes. We need to figure out how to network differently than we're doing, because Peira, you're talking about a lot of reps.
Oh yeah, I will definitely say, okay, the next 2 weeks I'm going hard. You know what I mean? I will know that I'm not getting a lot of other things done over these next 2 weeks. I might even message you and say, I'm not getting a lot of other things done these next 2 weeks. You're not going to hear a lot from me. I'm going hard and I'm interviewing. And that's where the keeping track in the Asana cards is huge, because I need to make sure that I am filing each person, because by day 3 or 4, I'm like, who did I talk to on Monday? I can't remember. And so recording those interviews, creating a folder for each interview, creating an Asana card that says what they're interviewing for, and all the other, and creating a link to their resume, just staying super organized. And then I will note in their Asana card who I've communicated what with, and it just has to all be written down, because you think you're talking to people and it feels like you're just talking to human beings and you're going to remember everybody, and you really don't.
You won't. Yeah.
And I really try.
And just to be clear on our sort of, if you're a larger school with many teachers and you're listening to this and you're thinking, wait, who on my team is going to go hard for 2 weeks and knock out 25 or 30 interviews?
Yeah.
It's a really good question to ask yourself if you're a listener. Be like, wait a minute, who on the team could actually listen to this episode, take on the responsibility and do it? And then the way our system works at the factory is we have people power. It currently meets, I think, Thursdays at like 11. And so you come up for air at least for like 45 minutes a week when you're deep in it. And you'll share, you'll give us a quick overview in people power. But we basically all know as a team, like, we're not really bothering Peira. When the time is right, she's going to present in people power all the opportunities.
Yeah.
And you'll ask for help when you need help, but otherwise sort of stay out of the way, because we know that's your one thing. Yeah.
And, I should say, because I know we haven't gotten to the next step yet, maybe we want to go there. The next step of demoing in person is another chunk of time.
So as we head into the close here, we've just gotten some fantastic detail from you, Peira. I've mostly just wanted to keep quiet as you just gave all this great wisdom. I think getting through the rest of the list that we set out at the beginning, the list we set out to cover, is probably the way to close. And there might even be another episode here about the specifics of the interview process, which was really kind of my thought as to what this was going to be. But in hearing the value of that list you gave, I just want to kind of focus on that. So let's drive through those final points and maybe close the episode out on that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, after interviews, I invite the top candidates to demos. And this is where I get to meet them in person, read their energy, and actually see them in the room with live human children. Because as I'm sure you all know, there's people who are great at interviews and maybe not as great teachers, and people who are not as great at interviews and maybe great teachers. And so if there's enough there in the interview where I would like to give them that next step, I will invite them to come in and do a 20-minute demo in the classroom. And we can talk more about what those demos look like in the future. But that is a really important way for me to assess how they actually are with kids. If they can actually implement what they say they can implement. We do those on video. We have the teachers video it. So it's just them and the teacher. I don't want to be hovering over them. I can assess it on the video later. And so it's just them in the classroom with the teacher and the kids, 20 minutes. I also make sure to send them a demo outline, which we can talk more about in the future. But they're given basically a framework game to choose from, and they come in and they're in the classroom. Once I've gotten interviews, demos, I've gotten a pretty good sense of who this person is. I reach out to their references. I like email references. I find it to be really effective way for me to track all the answers to the questions. So I will cut and paste those email references into our Asana. But this is the key with references. I can talk more about systems in the future, but the key with references is that you are actually not getting new information. You are reinforcing the information you already suspect, right? So I suspect this person might struggle a little bit with organization. You know, my reference questions will hit that up, and I will get information that reinforces that that this person is probably not great at organization, or maybe I was wrong and this person actually has great organizational skills. And there's a 1 to 10 rating system, and we can talk all about that in the future as well. But the reference step is less about discovering new information and more just about making sure my instincts on this person are now correct. I've gotten enough information about this person. Am I right about what I think? It is very rare that a reference surprises me at this point. And it's just a really good way to reinforce what I think at that point I already know. A couple of other things. Nate, at the beginning of this episode, talked about those follow-up calls, the red flags. I jokingly, but also not jokingly, always equate interviewing and hiring a little bit to dating. When you're dating somebody, you see those red flags where you say, I can change that in them, right?
I can fix him.
Yourself, I can fix this person, right? You know what? You probably can't. And you're either going to have to learn how to live with those weaknesses, right? Or the relationship's not going to work out. So I make sure that those red flags about this person are things that I communicate with them before we enter a relationship, right? Before we hire them, before we bring them on. So, I suspect that this person is, maybe I've had this happen. Somebody was late to their demo. And I said, that's not great. I don't love that, right? Who knows? Maybe they said there was train troubles. Were there really train troubles? I don't really know. I've made sure to ask about their timeliness in their reference questions, right? But now I'm still feeling that feeling in my stomach, like, are they going to be late all the time, right? So I call them and I ask them. It sounds awkward, but it's really, you can do it in a way that it feels like, you know what, we're going to be a team. Let's discuss this. And so I'll just say, I really love your resume. Your demo was fantastic. I'm a little concerned that you were late. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And you just go directly for those red flags and don't think to yourself, I'm going to be able to this, or just don't ignore the red flags and think to yourself, I'm going to be able to change this in this person, or maybe this person doesn't really have that problem. So that is a really important part of the process. Just tackling those head on and not trying to ignore them or change them. And then lastly, after I've done that follow-up call, I will bring it to the team. I will share. I find it really helpful just to, even if everybody doesn't really know the candidates in the way that I do, because they usually don't, I just find it helpful just to talk it through and have those other people to bounce off my concerns, my thoughts, what are the kind of people we really need, just to have those conversations. I often walk through not getting concrete answers from the team, but having more clarity in my own decisions. and what I feel needs to happen moving forward. And then we'll send out those offer sheets, and they usually take a few days to accept because the offer sheet has details. And then, if they've accepted, and I say, we hope you do in our email, please, I encourage them to take some time. I say, take a little time, read through this carefully. If you accept, which we hope you do, we will take you through the next steps. And those next steps are then their background checks and contracts and scheduling and training and all that stuff. So there's a lot in there, but yeah, that's the summary.
There's a lot in there, and I want to highlight a couple things, and then I think we can close this sucker because there's tons of details in there. But things like the references, we're always putting on that same Asana card. Everything is compiled in one place.
Oh,
and
yeah.
When you say Nate or Jessica or Ben or anybody else, go look at the references, we all know to go to one place and look at there, and we just comment in one place. And that's how we centralize everything. So you may be literally driving, the entire process, but we all just congregate in one little area.
Yeah.
Can
I give one concrete reference tip, Nate?
Yeah, totally.
I do a bunch of questions, and I say, rate them from 1 to 10. Like, how is this person's attention to detail, for example, from 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, and why, right? So I ask for a rating, and then I ask for a why. I will tell you, people give their references of people who love them, right?
Yes.
And so if you ever get a number that is below 8, that is not a good number.
Yeah, they're done.
Seems like there's
they didn't make it through.
Yeah. Because you're getting 9s and 10s from most references, but if I'm getting an 8 or a 7, that's when I'm like, my suspicion was right, or this is some information I need to be aware of.
So if their
Nobody's
NPS
ever given
score,
a 4.
if they have a human NPS score lower than 9, it's not good. A little nerd humor there for y'all.
Well, thank you, Peira, for being on. I feel like we're 100% have some additional episodes on maybe the demo process, maybe even detailed looks at how to collect references, read references, what are the actual reference questions, even the offer sheet. I mean, even our offer sheet process is actually quite detailed and involves team. So all of these things could be fascinating, I think, to our listeners.
Yeah, and I'm happy to speak more to the demos too, because there's a lot in there.
That's awesome.